Today, I'm going to talk about Ukrainian truths and Russian lies, and also address some of the misconceptions being spread about the Russo Ukraine war and how war criminal Vladimir Putin is using the lack of knowledge about Ukrainian history and the general acceptance of so called Russia's fictionalized history to justify his claim to Ukraine. Thank you for joining me on this ramble, which will take us from the present war back to the beginning of the Kingdom of Rus, which our little Russian tyrant claims is the beginning of Russian history. This is going to be a bit long, so you might want to grab some sustenance. I have. I'll also examine the notion that Ukrainians and Russians are brotherly or fraternal nations, with Russians designating themselves the big brother, and further explore why Russians believe Ukraine belongs to them, and that actually Ukraine isn't even a real country. One of the ways that this is most clearly seen is in the twisted version of history being espoused by the petite war criminal Putin and Russian propagandists. War criminal Putin discussed his version of so called Russian history, which proves that Ukraine belongs to Russia, in an interview with Ukraine hater Tucker Carlson. I'll be having a look at this interview a little later. He also expounds on his version of Russian history on other occasions, including his summit with President Trump in Alaska, which apparently caused Trump to call an abrupt end to the summit. But first, I'm going to talk about Russia the Great. Yes, Russia the great impostor, the great thief, the great monster. The Marquis de Custine was a French aristocrat who wrote extensively about Russia. In 1839, he wrote, Russian nature is a savage nature, indifferent to the sanctity of the given word, to any true feeling, to the sense of justice. Everything in it is a triumphant lie, deceit, and deception. The lack of any moral sense, the absence of the concept of right and duty. In other words, Russians are not burdened by decency, principles, morality, or conscience. The Russian world is indifferent to the life of individuals and to human suffering. The Russian mindset is the belief in the superiority of Russians and that everyone else is to be colonized. De Custine was appalled by the autocracy in Russia and by the people's apparent collaboration in their own oppression. Today, not much has changed, as the majority of Russians still support the government that is keeping them in oppression and poverty. 30% of Russians, that's 43 million Russians, still do not have running water or indoor plumbing. Many towns and villages have communal outdoor crappers. The average Russian salary is $1,000 a month. This is considered deep poverty in the West. A third of Russians make only $335 a month. The average pension is $300 a month. Other than Moscow and St. Petersburg, most of the rest of so called Russia has the characteristics of a third world country. Yet Russians still consider that they are superior to the rest of the world. So called Russia is also a terrorist, criminal state. It's culturally narcissistic, yet has a deep sense of inferiority. It's a racist nation whose stock and trade is war and genocide. It's an inhumane regime motivated by imperialist delusions. The Putin regime even runs a state sponsored program to assassinate political opponents. Civil servants whose job is to plan and execute political murders. Putin is an autocratic despot, an indicted war criminal, who's engaged in the largest child kidnapping and trafficking operation in the world. Every night, war criminal Putin sends up to 1,000 drones and missiles to Ukraine to destroy, kill, and maim Ukrainians. This is terrorism on an unprecedented scale. Yet the rest of the world barely pays attention while he bombs civilian homes, churches, hospitals, schools, and old age homes. No one knows the number of Ukrainians murdered by war criminal Putin, but estimates are in the hundreds of thousands. Terrorists like Osama bin Laden are hunted down and killed like dogs. Yet war criminal Putin is honored by a U.S. president who seems to be carrying on an inexplicable bromance with the tiny terrorist. Putin is honored with a red carpet, protected by the U.S. military. praised as a great leader, and gets a ride in the U.S. president's limousine. Trump can barely conceal his disdain for Ukraine and its president. He makes no distinction between aggressor and victim, which speaks to his materialist mentality and the absence of a sense of morality. Anyway, back to Putin. There are over 180,000 documented Russian war crimes under investigation at the moment, many of which are unspeakable. I have to mention, though, that there is a small segment of the Russian population that doesn't fit this profile. They're a very small minority of brave Russians who detest their government and the typical Russian mindset. Some commit brave, though futile, acts of isolated individual protest that land them with long prison terms. Others are members of partisan groups like Atesh, who attack trains and other military targets within so called Russia. Some have left so called Russia and have joined fighting units in Ukraine. Others use social media to criticize their government's actions in Ukraine. I salute them for their courage and principles, but they are a small number of Russians. I do not include in this group the majority of Russian nationalists, some of whom are quite prominent, who oppose the government of war criminal Putin, yet still support or are indifferent to Russian imperialist claims to Ukraine. The Russian terrorist state is also a thief of history. They stole the name, culture, and history of the medieval kingdom called Rus, which was centered in present day Ukraine. The Russian Empire had been known as Muscovy for almost 500 years, when in 1721, Peter I changed its name to the Russian Empire. Now, this was very clever of Peter. No one up to that time ever thought that Muscovy was the successor of the kingdom of Rus. Muscovy spent the first couple of centuries of its existence as an ulus, or territory, of the Mongol horde, subservient to it and collecting its taxes. Then the next couple of hundred years building an Asian empire. But Peter wanted to have a more European identity than Muscovy, so by renaming the Tsardom of Muscovy to the Russian Empire, which sounds like it's derived from the name Rus, he laid claim to Rus's past. Rus was known as Russia or Ruthenia, and not Peter I's invented name, which in Russian doesn't even sound like Rus. In Russian, Russian Empire is pronounced Rossiyskaya Imperia. It is this invention that Rossiya and Rus are the same entities on which the Lilliputian war criminal Putin and Russians base their claim of primacy over Ukraine. On its face, this is a ridiculous claim, since Moscow did not even become a principality until many years after the dissolution of Rus. It was also a long way away from Kiev, which was the center of Rus, almost 900 kilometers away, in fact, in an area called Zalicia, or beyond the forest, which indicated its remote location at that time. Nonetheless, so called Russia twisted its history like a pretzel to justify its claim as the successor state of Rus. The theft of the name and history of Rus is perhaps the world's first and greatest example of identity theft and cultural appropriation. There are also thieves of other countries and cultures. In less than 700 years from its inception, Muscovy, as it was known for most of its history, lived and developed by thieving, robbery, and the occupation of neighboring countries. From the middle of the 13th to the beginning of the 20th century, Muscovy increased its territory by invasion and occupation from a small city state of 500 square miles to 8.5 million square miles, stretching 6,000 miles and 11 time zones from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. They conquered, destroyed, and absorbed over 200 nationalities. So called Russia is a colonial empire and a prison of nations and nationalities, with 22 republics within Russia, mainly in Asia and Siberia, where the bulk of its vast natural resources are located. The powerful Principality of Rus occupied the area now called Ukraine, Belarus, and North European Russia. Kiev was the capital of Rus when around 1240 Kiev and Rus was destroyed by Mongol invasion. Yet Muscovian carpetbaggers assert that somebody sprinkled fairy dust over the wilderness that was Moscow in 1263, when Moscow first became a principality, and that after the destruction of Rus, it had magically moved to Moscow, a small wooden fortress town 900 kilometers north of Kiev, far away in an inhospitable northern wilderness, first inhabited by Finno-Ugric tribes. Ukraine had acquired its name before the dissolution of Rus, and it doesn't mean borderland, as the Russians would have us believe. Kraina means country or territory, not borderland, and Ukraini means in country, Ukraine. You can Google translate it for yourself. The word for border in Ukrainian is kordon, so borderland would be Prikordonia, not Ukraina. What Russians have done is taken the word krai, which means edge and sounds like Kraina, and Russians say it's this word that means borderland, but on the edge would be na kraju, not Ukraini or Ukraine. If anything, it's Moscow that was on the borderland of Rus, since its origin was within a remote territory of Rus, on the outskirts of Rus. The simple fact is that Ukraine is older than so called Russia. In fact, the area of present day Ukraine is where Slavs originated. The idea that Ukrainians are some sort of wayward tribe of Russians doesn't stand up to DNA evidence. According to DNA and linguistic studies, Slavs and Slavic languages originated around the 5th century in an area called Polisia, within the borders of present day Ukraine and Belarus. Kiev was the first Slav city, founded in 482 AD. DNA studies show ethnic Ukrainians have a 5 to 10% higher percentage of the DNA of the founding cultures of the Slavs than do ethnic Russians. Slavic migration occurred outwardly from the area now known as Ukraine, northward to so called Russian lands, and not the other way around. Literacy was spread from the south, first from Greece and Byzantium, then to Kiev, before reaching farther north to Muscovy. The population around Moscow was originally inhabited by Finnic tribes, such as the Miria, Mordvins, and Udmurts, until Slavs began to migrate from present day Ukraine and Belarus. The Slavs assimilated with the Finnic populations, and by the late 13th century, this area around Moscow became Muscovy. Maps of the era, even into the 19th century, refer to Muscovy or Moscovia, not Russia, while the area of Ukraine is referred to as Rus, Ruthenia, or Ukraine. To give one example, there is a map engraved by Adrian Junebek, who was employed by Peter I, and this map is dated 1705, before Peter changed the name of Muscovy to the Russian Empire. It clearly shows the territories of Ukraine, Belarus, and Muscovia, but not Russia. This map is housed at the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg, and you can look it up on the internet. You will note that at that time there was no doubt of the existence of Ukraine. You will not find a map before 1721 that shows Russia or the Russian Empire, because there was no entity called Russia or the Russian Empire before 1721. There was only Muscovy or Moscovia. Now, why were Ukrainians referred to as Ruthenians by other nationalities, while Ukrainians referred to themselves either as Rusyns or Ukrainians? Well, it's the same as we refer to the people who live in Hungary as Hungarians, but they call themselves Magyars, and to the people who live in Germany as Germans, but they refer to themselves as Deutsche. Muscovites, who later called themselves Russians, were never called Ruthenians. Only Ukrainians were called Ruthenians. So, with the simple stroke of Peter I's quill in 1721, Muscovy changed its history and culture from a mixture of Asiatic, Finno-Ugric, and Slavic tax collectors for the Mongolian horde to an association with the more illustrious Rus. So called Russia extended its historical timeline by several hundred years to the time of the founding of Rus instead of the founding of Muscovy, which occurred only centuries later. In addition, they converted their Mongol Asian identity to a pseudo European identity. Now, so called Russia claims to be 400 years older than it actually is by dating its origin to the founding of Rus, not Muscovy. This name change was probably the most successful act of rebranding in history, so that today most people associate so called Russia with a history going back almost 1,200 years to Kiev instead of so called Russia's real history, which is that of Muscovy and doesn't even go back 800 years. Poland's Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski stated in a speech at the United Nations that Ukraine is a country with a longer history than Russia. Ukraine has a history, language, and identity and aspirations all of its own. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a former U.S. National Security Advisor, wrote, "Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. Russia without Ukraine would then become a predominantly Asian imperial state and more distant from Europe." So we can see that so called Russia needs Ukraine to validate its existence. Ukrainian historian Leonid Zeleznyak writes, Moscow's rights to the historical and cultural heritage of princely Kiev are no bigger and no less than the rights of Madrid, Lisbon, Paris, and Bucharest to the history and culture of Rome. Neither were the former direct creators of the Latin culture of Rome, nor is Moscow related to the creation of the culture of Kievan Rus. Even 18th century Russian historian Nikolai Karamzin, one of the first to fictionalize Russian history, wrote, Moscow owes its greatness to the Mongol Khans. Here's an excerpt from an unusually candid article from Russia Beyond, which is operated by RT, the propaganda arm of the Russian government. The article is called The Mongol Invasion Was the Reason Russia Formed. It states, the Muscovian population was forced to pay substantial tributes, and Muscovite princes were only allowed to rule their duchies by the permission of the Khan of the Golden Horde. Moscow rapidly became Asianized. Its princes married Mongol princesses, and whatever had remained of the old traditions was swallowed up in the new order. In addition, Muscovites greeted each other with the Moslem salam and wore Oriental clothing. Many Muscovite churches incorporate a Muslim crescent at the base of Orthodox crosses, which you can still see to this day on churches from this era. Many Muscovite families were descended from Mongols. Many Russian words like dengi, the word for money, were derived from Mongol languages. The most significant inheritance of the Mongols to Muscovy, and then the Russian state, is the principle of universal subservience to the ruler and the subjugation of the individual, which we see at work today in so called Russia. Karl Marx, the founder of Marxism, but also a historian, wrote, Russia, which has nothing to do with Rus and received, or rather stole its current name, at best in the 18th century, nevertheless brazenly claims the historical heritage of Rus, created 800 years earlier. However, Muscovy history is the history of the Mongol Golden Horde, sewn to the history of Russia with white threads and completely falsified. The cradle of Muscovy is the blood swamp of Mongol slavery, and not the harsh glory of the Kievan era. Now, I'm old enough and cynical enough to know that my comments here are not likely to change minds that are already made up. You can't reason people out of a belief if that belief has been arrived at without reasoning. It definitely won't change war criminal Putin's or most Russians' minds, or even the minds of many Americans who have strangely taken the side of the Russian aggressor. Belief perseverance, which is the maintenance of a belief despite evidence that firmly contradicts it, is a feature of human thinking. My hope, though, is that this talk might result in some questioning of the Russian narrative, more clear headed thinking, and provide some useful information for those who are trying to honestly evaluate the Russo Ukraine war, the history of Ukraine, and its relationship with so called Russia. Before we continue running our fingers through the topsoil of your Ukrainian history and Russian bullshit history, Let me get personal. Since this is my first vlog or podcast, or whatever these things are called, please bear in mind that I'm of advanced years and I may wander a bit off topic, or forget where I am, or doze off, or need a bathroom break. But I will eventually return to the subject because I've got some cheat sheets here. Since I don't know how to work sophisticated software, there won't be any fancy slides or graphic presentations. So you might need a pen and paper because I'll be throwing out a few dates and names if you're interested. I'm sure many of you don't give a damn about whose version of Russian history is correct. So why go back 1,000 years? Well, the simple reason is that war criminal Putin justifies his war on Ukraine by going back 1,000 years in an attempt to prove Russian ownership of Ukraine. In his interview with Tucker Carlson, he didn't start with NATO encroachment or his fantasy about Ukrainian Nazis or persecution of Russians in Ukraine, but he started with a half-hour Russian bullshit history lecture. He also constantly refers to this bogus history. But first, full disclosure. I am an ethnic Ukrainian. I was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany in 1946, just after the end of World War II. My parents were Ukrainians who were taken to Germany in 1941 to work as slave laborers along with 2 million other Ukrainians who were taken by the Nazis when they invaded Soviet Ukraine. When the war ended, they were not given German citizenship or even residence in Germany, except in DP camps while awaiting return to the Soviet Union, often at gunpoint and prodded with bayonets. There they would meet uncertain fates in the labor camps of the Gulag or execution. I am among the fortunate 20% or so of DPs who managed to avoid repatriation to the Soviet Union. Instead, we were accepted by countries such as England, Canada, the USA, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and others. Okay, so the atrocities being committed now are a continuation of the centuries of atrocities and genocide by Russians against Ukrainians, one of the most recent of which was the Holodomor between 1932 and 1933, the artificial famine created by Joseph Stalin when millions of Ukrainians were deliberately starved to death. My father lived under Polish rule, so the Holodomor did not directly affect him. However, my mother was from Zhytomyr, which was under Russian rule. She was 6 years old and in the last stages of starvation, eating dirt pies when the famine ended. Like many others, the nightmares and resulting poor health stayed with her all her life, and she suffered from PTSD. In 1941, 8 years after the Holodomor ended, the Nazis took her by cattle car at the age of 14 to Germany to work as a slave laborer. She never saw her parents or family again. This has been the similar fate, one way or another, of Ukrainians over the centuries. This is not a unique story, but is one that is shared by many of the friends I grew up with and by many millions of Ukrainians. So, back to the present. Apologists and water carriers for so called Russia say so called Russia felt threatened by the West, that it feared NATO's encroachment, that the West had promised so called Russia that NATO would not expand closer to its borders, that it was concerned about the genocide and discrimination by Ukrainians of the Russian speakers of Donetsk, that Ukraine was ruled by a cabal of Nazis, and that after many warnings by the diminutive war criminal Putin, he had to act in the face of an imminent attack by Ukraine on so called Russia's borders. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that the goal of Russia's special military operation is to stop any war that could take place on Ukrainian territory or that could start from there. Lavrov also stated the war which we are trying to stop, which was launched against us using Ukrainian people. I'm calling BS on this. Anyone who has a pulse, a functioning brain, eyesight, and a TV clicker would watch on the morning of February 24th, 2022, when Russian tanks, troops, and aircraft poured across the Ukrainian border. There is only one aggressor here, and that is so called Russia. The notion that Ukraine launched the war or was about to attack a nuclear power with an army many times larger and vaunted as the second most powerful army in the world is laughable. Ukraine wasn't even remotely prepared for the full scale war unleashed upon it. For the first couple of months before Western aid started rolling in, beside its outnumbered National Guard and professional army, Ukraine relied on volunteers armed with ancient weapons. Ukraine had nothing to gain from attacking so called Russia. The idea is preposterous. Ukrainians want nothing to do with so called Russia and only want to be left alone. As far as NATO courting Ukraine to join it, the last thing NATO, or for that matter the EU, wanted was for Ukraine to become a member. As far as the EU was concerned, Ukraine was a basket case which would require huge sums of money. NATO, particularly America and Germany, has consistently over the last 20 years rejected any possibility of Ukraine joining it, and to this day are still against Ukraine joining NATO. The last thing they wanted was the possibility of having to defend Ukraine against so called Russia. So called Russia's only fear of NATO was if Ukraine somehow became a member, then Russia couldn't attack Ukraine because Ukraine would then be protected from attack because of NATO's Article 5. War criminal Putin did not invade Ukraine because he was afraid that Ukraine might join NATO. He invaded Ukraine precisely because Ukraine was not a member of NATO and could therefore not rely on NATO's protection. NATO is a defensive alliance which has never threatened its neighbors. The only purpose of NATO and the only threat so called Russia has from NATO, and the only thing so called Russia fears from NATO, is that it prevents it from attacking NATO members. NATO doesn't encroach on so called Russia, but rather prevents Russian encroachment on NATO members, which Russia has done repeatedly in the past before these countries were members of NATO. Another lie put forward by war criminal Putin and repeated by Russia centric apologists was that there was a promise by NATO not to expand closer to so called Russia. This supposed promise was made during negotiations about the reunification of Germany in 1990. However, President Yeltsin's foreign minister Andrei Kazyrev was asked in an interview if there was an agreement or promise that NATO would not move closer to the Soviet Union's borders. His response was, "We tried when I was foreign minister to find any trace of that in the archives, and we failed." And Gorbachev later denied receiving any kind of this assurance. So, to my knowledge, it's a total nonsense. In fact, this reference to NATO not moving an inch to the east was a reference to not extending NATO an inch into East Germany during the negotiations in 1989 leading to its reunion with West Germany. That while Germany itself would be under NATO, there would be no NATO military personnel or bases in the former East Germany. Even then, it was just one of many statements, non binding, made in negotiations. Moreover, the statement would have been ridiculous in the context of this period in history, as all of the East European countries that ultimately joined NATO were either still part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact, which was controlled by the Soviet Union. So membership in NATO by these countries was not even contemplated, as so called Russia did not even exist yet, and these countries were still part of the Soviet Union. Near the beginning of war criminal Putin's reign, he even expressed an interest in joining NATO himself, as did Boris Yeltsin, whom war criminal Putin succeeded. In an interview with David Frost, war criminal Putin said it was hard for him to visualize NATO as an enemy. He said, "Russia is part of the European culture, and I cannot imagine my own country in isolation from Europe and what we often call the civilized world." So called Russia is so unconcerned about NATO that it accepted Sweden and Finland joining NATO at the outbreak of the Russian invasion of Ukraine with minimal objection. It's so unconcerned about being attacked by NATO that it has withdrawn most of its forces from the borders of Finland and moved them to fight in Ukraine. So called Russia expresses little concern that Finland is now in NATO and right on Russia's border, despite having fought a war with Finland in 1939. There are minimal Russian forces on the borders with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. When Russia starts massing forces on their borders, then you may start to worry about a Russian invasion of these countries. These are all NATO members and are also countries that border so called Russia. So called Russia knows it has little to fear from NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance formed to combat Soviet, then Russian aggression against its members. Just look at NATO's members' timid behavior during this war. They're afraid of every imaginary red line Moscow draws. In some ways, NATO has allied itself with so called Russia, even forbidding Ukraine to take certain actions against so called Russia. So called Russia's only concern with NATO is that NATO hinders so called Russia from reforming the old Soviet Union's borders. So called Russia sends drones and warplanes into NATO territories. And what's the response? They don't shoot the drones down. In some cases, they've even escorted them back to Ukraine, where they can destroy Ukrainians. They call meetings to wring their hands over what they're going to do about those naughty Russians. The coalition of the willing should be renamed the Coalition of Enthusiastic Conversationalists, holding conferences and issuing strongly worded declarations, which are not backed up with actions, while Ukraine is ravaged, raped, and ruined. Ukraine is the dam holding back the savagery of the Russian Federation. If Ukraine falls, then the Russians are on the Polish and Baltic countries' borders, and now possessing Ukraine's weaponry, and the Ukrainian army, who will now be forced to fight for Russia. In the meantime, Ukraine is on fire from nightly 1,000 strong drone and missile attacks, while NATO fiddles, not even willing to provide an air shield over Ukraine. NATO's attitude is pragmatic rather than principled. They feel they have to support Ukraine, but not enough that they incur any pain on themselves. Then you have the corpulent Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, and Russian puppet, who said the good thing is that there is a territory between Hungary and Russia that is now called Ukraine. Ukraine is a country with a very difficult fate. Why should we share in this difficult fate? We have our own fate, which is much easier than that of the Ukrainians. So he appears to recognize that having Russia as a neighbor is not a good thing. Yet he refuses to assist Ukraine and stands in the way of every initiative of the EU and NATO to support Ukraine. He regularly commutes to Moscow to fawn over Putin. Whatever happened to the brave Hungarians who fought the Soviets in 1956? Although not stated in so many words, Orban's position is not so much different from NATO's, which is it's tough to be Ukraine. Thank God Ukraine exists as a buffer between us and so called Russia, so it can bear the brunt of destruction. When Ukraine falls, then we'll have to deal with Russia. So the West is guilty of complacency and weakness, beginning first with hoodwinking Ukraine into thinking the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances was a legitimate guarantee of its sovereignty, and then pretty much ignoring it when Russia invaded Crimea and the Donbass. The Budapest Memorandum, signed in 1994 by Bill Clinton, John Major, and Boris Yeltsin, stipulated that in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal and its fleet of nuclear bombers, the US, the UK, and Russia would maintain the integrity of Ukraine's borders. There were two things missing from the memorandum: the word guarantee, and that the memorandum was not ratified by the governing bodies of the countries whose presidents signed it. So when Russia invaded Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, other than some tut-tutting and minimal sanctions, the signatories basically said, what agreement? The lesson of the Budapest Memorandum is that pieces of paper, no matter who signs them, are worthless, and that the only security guarantee is nukes in your arsenal. If you've got them, keep them, and if you don't, get them. Instead of honoring the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, when so called Russia invaded Crimea and then the Donbass in 2014, it was business as usual, meaning cheap fuel for Europe and a blank check for Russia. Germany was very chummy with the Russians and even built two pipelines to carry cheap Russian oil. Many German politicians got rich from kissing Russian ass. The stage was set for so called Russia's full scale invasion of Ukraine by America's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, Europe's refusal to provide for its own defense, the coziness of European leaders, especially Germany and France, with war criminal Putin, and his legitimation on the world stage. These factors contributed to war criminal Putin feeling that the West would not oppose him if he invaded Ukraine, and he was right. The US and the rest of the West was initially ready to accommodate war criminal Putin's conquest of Ukraine, with the US even offering a ride to President Zelensky. When he asked for ammunition instead, it was some time in coming, and even then it was doled out parsimoniously, too little and too late, mainly obsolete, and with the most lethal systems removed, and even with conditions as to how they could be used and prohibitions on not attacking certain targets for fear that Russia might actually lose the war. If it was not for the decision of the Ukrainian president and the courage of the people of Ukraine, the West would have quickly accommodated itself to the New World Order, and business would have proceeded as usual. So called Russia has never accepted Ukraine's right to exist in the first place. From the time Ukraine declared its independence in 1991, so called Russia has contested Ukraine's borders and has not ceased interfering in Ukraine politically, socially, and culturally. Putin has stated that Ukrainian lands did not even exist before the Soviet Union granted them to Ukraine. There are three main reasons at the root of why war criminal Putin invaded Ukraine. All the rest is propaganda. One was to stay in power. He was losing popularity and also feared the spread of Ukrainian democracy. Two is the colonialist imperialist mindset by which so called Russia has grown by conquest and which has been part of the Russian character for centuries. As a consequence, war criminal Putin is trying to recreate the Soviet Union. Three is the deep seated belief in the creation myth about so called Russia. Russians believe they are the sole successors of the Rus Empire and that Kiev is the cornerstone of the Russian Empire. Without Ukraine, Moscow's claim to be the successor of Rus loses credibility. Without Kiev, there's only Muscovy, and Muscovy was not Rus. Ukraine is what makes so called Russia European. More than three-quarters of the landmass of so called Russia is Asian. For the first almost 400 years of Muscovy's existence, its orientation and conquests were eastward from Moscow to Siberia. In the context of Ukraine's existence in the 21st century, it's really irrelevant to Ukraine what so called Russia's dystopian origins are. But since they insist that they are the successor state of Rus, and therefore entitled to ownership of all the former Rus principalities, such as Ukraine, then we have to examine the history of Rus and its remnants. Note that the petite war criminal Putin did not start the Tucker Carlson interview with a recitation of grievances about NATO encroachment or fear of European Union encroachment or about Ukrainian Nazis or discrimination against Russian speakers. Instead, he began the interview with a 27-minute recounting of Russian bullshit history to prove that Ukraine belongs to so called Russia. That so called Russia is actually the sole heir to the Rus Empire, which geographically and historically is absurd, and that Ukrainians don't exist but are really Russian. Sir Anthony Beevor, a respected British military historian, in a recent interview stated that Putin's version of history is scrambled, self contradictory, and in many cases ridiculous. I mean, if one's going to be talking about Russia owning Ukraine, actually, it's the other way around. I mean, Russia should be part of Ukraine if one's going to be talking about Kiev and Rus. It's like his essay before his invasion of Ukraine. It's scrambled and completely ridiculous in many ways, based on a curious fantasy. Okay, so called Russia's historical claim on Ukraine is the underlying justification for so called Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Further motivation for the invasion is war criminal Putin's obsession with recreating the old Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. In addition, there is nothing like a war to accomplish his need to stay in power. NATO, Nazis, Protection of Russian speakers are a smokescreen. Up to 1654, for over 400 years after the dissolution of Rus, Ukraine had no ties with Muscovy. After 1654 to 1991, for almost 340 years, Ukraine became first a Muscovite colony, then a Russian, and finally a Soviet colony. Russians grew accustomed to ruling it. They wanted back. Also, possession of Ukraine would give so called Russia legitimacy. How can they lay claim to being the successor to Rus without actually possessing the original nucleus of the land of Rus? One absolute about the kingdom of Rus was that whoever ruled Kiev ruled Rus. You most likely had never heard about Rus before the diminutive war criminal Putin mentioned it in his article and in the Carlson interview. But Rus was an important medieval kingdom. It incorporated Ukraine, Belarus, and the European part of present day so called Russia. At its peak, Rus, with its capital in Kiev, was the largest state in Europe, consisting of over 500,000 square miles, which is about the present size of France, Germany, Italy, and England combined. Kiev's population was over 100,000, larger than London or Paris. Kievan royalty was intermarried with the ruling royal families of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Hungary, Poland, England, France, Byzantium, and the Holy Roman Empire. Note that Moscow was on the periphery of Rus, about 900 kilometers away from Kiev, and didn't even exist as a principality until after the dissolution of Rus. The reason it's important to discuss the history of Rus is because so called Russia's and the tiny war criminal Putin's claim to Ukraine is based entirely on the myth that so called Russia is the sole inheritor of Rus. There can be no Russia which claims direct descent from Rus without actually possessing the heart of Rus, which was Kiev in Ukraine. It's like saying you are the direct descendant of Rome, but oops, Rome is 900 kilometers away and we don't actually live there or govern it or speak the language, but it's ours. Just as Italians linguistically and genetically are the descendants of Romans, Ukrainians are linguistically and genetically also the descendants of Rus. How could Muscovy be the successor of the Rus Empire when, for the first 250 years of its history, it had been a vassal of the Mongol Empire? It had no connection to the land of Ukraine. In fact, it had no connection with Ukraine for over 400 years. In 1263, Muscovy became a small principality within the northern Grand Principality of Vladimir Suzdal. Muscovy was not much bigger than a large town and was hardly an empire, much less the successor of the mighty Rus. Moscow used its position as a principal tax collector for the Mongol horde and the ruthlessness of its princes to grow through acquisition and conquest of its neighboring principalities until in 1547, Ivan IV, also known as the Terrible, proclaimed himself Tsar of Muscovy. Keep in mind this took almost 300 years to accomplish, and at no time during this period did they control or possess any part of Ukraine. It wasn't for another 100 years, in 1654, that they even entered into an alliance with Ukraine. But I'll address that later. Excuse me. You might want to read the article by war criminal Vladimir Putin called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which came out just prior to war criminal Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It is war criminal Putin's equivalent of Hitler's Mein Kampf, the political manifesto of Nazi Party leader Adolf Hitler. The book outlines many of war criminal Putin's beliefs, his ideology, and his future plans for Ukraine. The article was actually written by war criminal Putin's ghostwriter and aide Vladimir Medinsky, who is not a historian, but a PR guy. He once stated, "Facts by themselves don't mean very much. Everything begins not with facts, but with interpretations. This should give you a clue about the factual nature of his recounting of the history of Ukraine and so called Russia. Most recently, Medinsky emerged as the Russian lead negotiator in the ill fated Istanbul ceasefire negotiations, where he demanded the surrender of Ukraine. So, war criminal Putin's bullshit history of the relationship between Ukraine and so called Russia is not based on history but fantasy. He uses the name Rus and Russia as though they are the same entity, but they are not. He dates Russian history back 1200 years to the origins of Rus. However, it's a fantasy because the origin of Muscovy in a swamp in the furthermost regions of northeast medieval Rus did not occur until 400 years after the founding of Rus. Far from being fraternal older brothers, it is so called Russians who are the new kids on the block. Their history began in the 13th century, over 400 years after Kiev became the capital of Rus, and 800 years after the founding of Kiev. Google, how old is Russia the country? And a typical Russo-centric Wikipedia entry states the traditional start date of specifically Russian history is the establishment of the Rus state in 862. Wrong. Just because Peter I renamed Muscovy to the Russian Empire in 1721 doesn't give it any claim to Rus history. Muscovy had no association with the Rus state, as Muscovy did not even exist when Rus was destroyed in 1240. But so called Russians don't just believe that Rus is their cultural ancestor, but they are the only real descendants of Rus and entitled to rule all the former territories of Rus. And the Ukrainians are actually confused Russians. However, Ukraine has never been called Russia. It was called Rus and Ruthenia and Ukraine, but never Russia. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine has little to do with the supposed encroachment of NATO or US machinations in Ukraine or the laughable claims about Ukraine being ruled by Nazis. They tell you that Russian history is over 1,000 years old, going back to the beginning of Rus in the 9th century, that so called Russia is the successor of Rus, that it's the big brother to Ukrainians who are a lesser tribe of Russians called Malorus or Little Russians, that Ukrainians are not even a real nationality, but a sort of a breakaway tribe of confused Russian peasants who got lost wandering around on the Ukrainian steppes 900 kilometers from Moscow, and that the Ukrainian language is not even a language but a peasant dialect of Russian, and that Ukraine was an invention of Lenin. As Dmitry Medvedev, a reputed alcoholic, a former Russian president, and a key henchman of war criminal Putin, said recently, there's nothing to comment on because Ukrainians are Russians. Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. At a conference in St. Petersburg, Putin declared, all of Ukraine is ours. He's also said, we are just taking back what is rightfully ours. The central question is, have Ukrainians historically been a separate nation, or are they Russian? To those who know the history of Ukraine and so called Russian history, this would be a laughable question. So called Russia has no claim to Ukraine other than a phony treaty signed in 1654, which began the takeover and integration of Ukraine with so called Russia, which I'll get into a little later. There's plenty of archival and historical documentation recording the separate development of Ukraine and so called Russia. Unfortunately, most Western historians obtain their education in Russo-centric study programs. As the former head of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Alexei Danilov, said, Russia spoke nonsense about us and the West believed it. The books in your universities were printed by Russia. They are all lies and deception. This is a big problem. It's not only our problem, but also yours. If you do not have good information, you are making incorrect decisions. We lose the best of our best at the front every day. War criminal Putin is a modern fascist. He is Hitler's Siamese twin. The West does not want to admit this, and the situation that existed in the 1930s is being repeated now. If the West does not come to its senses, it would be a great disaster for the world. The West cannot allow authoritarian, totalitarian countries to take over the world. This is very serious. In January of this year, I lost my nephew at the front. My godson had part of his leg torn off. After these things, people tell me that we have to have talks about something with war criminal Putin. He should be standing trial in front of the International Tribunal. One way of establishing the truth of history is to examine your history as observed by historians of other nations. Theodore Delamare was a French politician, a senator, editor of a government newspaper, and secretary of the Paris Geographical Society. In 1869, in a petition to the French Senate regarding the teaching of Ukrainian and Russian history in French universities, he wrote, "Just a century ago, people in France and Europe could easily differentiate Rus from Muscovy. History shouldn't forget people we know now as Ruthenians or Ukrainians were known previously as Russians or Russes, and people we call now as Russians were Muscovites, and their land was called Muscovy. We see that university science mixes two completely different peoples. Moreover, two peoples who oppose each other, given their separate origins and their traditions of historical development. The Rus occupied the territory between Moscow and Poland, but in the last century they were defeated by the conquerors, Moscow, who gave themselves the name of the defeated people to have a supposedly legal basis for their entry into the acquired possessions. This has led to the fact that Russians and Muscovites now seem to be equivalent names, although in reality, historically, they are completely different. Such deliberate mixing of names allowed the Muscovites to appropriate the history of Rus. Now remember, this was written by a Frenchman, but reflected general knowledge about Rus and Muscovy in 1869, only 140 years after the Peter I rebranded Muscovy and called it the Russian Empire. There were no illusions then that Ukrainians were Russians, and that so-called Russia was the inheritor of Rus, because everyone knew that they weren't Russians, but Muscovites, and they were inheritors of the Mongol horde. Russian history has been falsified for centuries. If it hasn't just been falsified, it's been deleted. For 75 years under the Soviet Union, and prior to that for 200 years under the Russian Empire, so called Russia occupied an alternate universe where its history was fictionalized, romanticized, lobotomized, dramatized, and plagiarized. The process of fictionalizing so called Russia as the sole descendant of Rus has been going on for centuries. Most Russians, and particularly war criminal Putin, still live in this alternate historical universe. It's been said that to understand the present, one must know the past, but whoever controls the present controls the past. In a reference to the Russian regime's habit of rewriting history, an old joke says, "The future is certain, it's only the past that is unpredictable." To date, so called Russia has been in the driver's seat. Its version of past and present history has been universally accepted. Whether it controls the future is now being decided on Ukrainian battlefields. But today's so called Russia has several incarnations since its ignoble beginnings as a small village in a swamp in the remote northeastern forests of the former kingdom of Rus. By the way, it may surprise you to know that present day so called Russia is actually quite a young country. It was only formed in December of 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved and the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic became the Russian Federation. In fact, Ukraine is actually 4 months older than so called Russia, having declared its independence in August of 1991. It may also surprise you to know that the Russian Terrorist Federation isn't necessarily the legitimate successor of the former Soviet Union. After all, the Russian Socialist Republic was only one of the constituent states of the Soviet Union. Why was it allowed to take over the assets and role of the Soviet Union? It was only as a matter of convenience that the international community de facto allowed so called Russia to be the successor state to the whole Soviet Union. There was no legal mechanism that allowed so called Russia to succeed the USSR. The USSR was composed of 15 socialist republics. The so called Russia became the sole successor state of the whole Soviet Union, while the other post Soviet states were recognized as successors only to their corresponding Union republics. Because the Russian SFSR had 75% of the population of the former USSR, the Russian Terrorist Federation was allowed to take over all the embassies, assets, and liabilities of the Soviet Union, including the Soviet Union's permanent seat on the Security Council of the United Nations, despite the fact that there was no legal mechanism for it to do so. Excuse me. So let's examine the history of Ukraine and of so called Russia, according to war criminal Putin in his Carlson interview. He begins with a lie in his first sentence when he says he will only take 30 seconds to give a little historical background. Then he spends almost 30 minutes on the subject. War criminal Putin tells Carlson the Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood. It's considered to be the establishment of the Russian state in 862 when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign. In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, came to Kiev. So Russia began to develop with two centers of power, Kiev and Novgorod. Okay, let's examine this statement. It's an accepted fact that the founders of Rus were Varangians or Vikings, ruled by the Rurikid dynasty, who were eventually absorbed by the native Slavs. However, there was no state called the Russian state in 862. There was a state called Rus, not Russia. As we know, so called Russia didn't exist until 1721. Rus was also not a centralized state, but a very loose confederation of principalities composed of many ethnicities, not all of which were Slavic. Novgorod, while important, was not equal to Kiev. There is even some doubt whether Novgorod even existed as early as 862. The only reason war criminal Putin mentions Novgorod is because it was the first Slavic state that Moscow conquered and absorbed some 240 years after the dissolution of Rus. War criminal Putin continues. The next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988. This was the baptism of Russia when Prince Vladimir baptized Russia. From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Again, there was no Russian state. Grand Prince Volodymyr did not baptize so called Russia because it didn't exist. He baptized Rus, and it definitely was not centralized. It was composed of about a dozen principalities ruled by princes of the Rurikid line who owed fealty to the Grand Prince of Kiev, but who were constantly warring with each other. Moreover, the Finno-Ugric tribes, who comprised a large part of the population of the Moscow region in 988, remained pagan until they were eventually Christianized by Rus missionaries. War criminal Putin continues. The throne was passed not directly from father to eldest son, but from the prince who had passed away to his brothers, then to his sons in different lines. All this led to the fragmentation and the end of Rus as a single state. This is true, but now he mentions that the state was not called Russia, but Rus, as though the two quite distinct names are the same, and that it was no longer a single state, but fragmented. While Rus had been in a state of dissolution since around 1132, the Mongol invasion between 1237 and 1242 devastated Kiev and the major cities of Rus and marked the end of Rus as a state. When empires end, their constituent parts form separate identities. The southern and the northern principalities of former Rus developed along completely separate paths with their own cultures and languages. When the Roman Empire dissolved, its constituent parts did not claim to be Rome. Britain did not claim to be Roman. Spain did not claim to be Roman. Gaul did not claim to be Roman. When Rome was succeeded by the Eastern Roman Empire located in Constantinople, the Byzantines were Greek and never claimed to be Roman. When the Holy Roman Empire succeeded the Eastern Roman Empire, they did not claim to be Roman or Greek because they were Germans. Yet the Muscovites claimed they were Rus, even though they were only a distant province with little to do with its founding and subsequent growth. War criminal Putin goes on. The southern part, including Kiev, by the way, and some other cities, simply lost independence, while northern cities preserved some of their sovereignty. They had to pay tribute to the Horde, but they managed to preserve some of their sovereignty. And then a unified Russian state began to take shape with its center in Moscow. I'll point out again, there was no state called Russia, unified or otherwise, after the destruction of Rus. Moscow was not even one of the princely principalities of Rus during Rus's existence. Rus was not even mentioned in the Mongols' first two censuses. There is a legend that Moscow existed as a small village in 1147, but it wasn't until 1263 that Daniel Alexandrovich, from one of the minor lines of the Rurikid dynasty, was elevated to become the first prince of Moscow. The so-called unified Russian state war criminal Putin refers to in 1263 consisted only of Moscow, which was a small settlement of a few thousand people, and it was subordinate to the Principality of Vladimir, hardly the successor to the vast kingdom of Rus. However, by the late 14th century, Moscow had become quite powerful as the chief collaborator and tax collector for the Mongol horde and was able to incorporate Vladimir itself. The process of conquering and annexing other former northern Rus principalities continued into the late 15th and 16th centuries with the conquest of the Novgorod Republic in 1478, followed by the acquisition, conquest, and annexation of the principalities and republics of Tver, Ryazan, Pskov, Smolensk, Rostov, and Yaroslavl. These had all been rivals and competitors of Muscovy. They and Moscow became the nucleus of Muscovy and formed the present-day part of European so-called Russia. After the decline of the Mongol horde, Muscovy expanded by annexing the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberia, thus becoming a vast Eurasian empire. Meanwhile, the southern principalities, including Kiev, did not lose their independence after the dissolution of Rus, but maintained their sovereignty for a couple of hundred years after the dissolution of Rus. The southern part of Rus, incorporating much of present-day Ukraine, became the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia under King Danilo, whose father was the last Grand Duke of Kiev. It subsequently became the Kingdom of Ruthenia, the etymological name by which Ukraine came to be called. It's true that they paid tribute to the Mongols, but unlike Moscow, this proto-Ukrainian state sometimes fought the Mongols and sometimes fought with them. The Mongol influence on Ruthenian life was minimal. The Mongol invasion of Rus is pretty much the point at which the northern Rus principalities and southern Rus principalities diverged. It was a fork in the road. One went one way and the other another. As war criminal Putin himself stated, Rus was no longer a single state. The nucleus of the North Rus became Muscovy, and the nucleus of South Rus became Ruthenia or Ukraine. Not only did Muscovy not preserve its sovereignty, as falsely stated by the diminutive war criminal Putin, but the ruling powers were dependent on the Mongol horde. Russian historians are lying when they state that their princes were independent from the Mongol horde. A major factor in the ascendancy of Muscovy was the subjugation of its rulers by their Mongol overlords. The Moscow princes became tax collectors for and subservient to the Mongol horde. They declared their fealty to the Mongolian overlords by traveling to the Mongol capitals and crawling on their hands and knees to show their subservience. For over 2 centuries, Muscovy was a Mongol ulus or territory. It was the Mongols who granted them their titles and made them agents for collecting the tribute from the other Muscovian principalities. It was the Mongols who, for almost 250 years, decided who the primary rulers of the princedoms would be. For example, Prince Yaroslav II of Vladimir was poisoned by the Mongols for being disobedient. Prince Mikhail of Chernihiv was executed in the capital of the Golden Horde for refusing to worship Mongol idols. Prince Mikhail of Tver had his heart ripped out in the same capital. The Muscovite population was forced to pay substantial tributes, and their princes were only allowed to rule their duchies by permission of the Khan of the Golden Horde. Ultimately, due to the wealth and power they managed to accumulate as the money bags for the Mongols, the Muscovite rulers did begin to assert their independence as the Mongols' power waned. However, they continued to pay tribute until the time of Peter I, when in 1700, according to the Treaty of Constantinople between the Tsar of Muscovy and the Ottoman Empire, Muscovy was freed from paying further tribute to the Khan of Crimea, the Ottoman Empire's vassal. It should be noted that the preamble of the Treaty of Constantinople did not refer to the state of Russia, but to the state of Muscovy and to the Tsar of Muscovy. War criminal Putin next asserts that a wall has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the southern parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space. Well, this wall did not emerge recently, but emerged 800 years ago in the 13th century with the breakup of Rus. And they certainly have never occupied the same historical, spiritual, linguistic, or cultural space. And geographically, as I've said before, Moscow was 900 kilometers away from Kiev. Ukraine and Muscovy did not share the same history. For example, spiritually, the Muscovite Orthodox Church did not even recognize the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and immigrants from Ukraine to Muscovy had to be rebaptized. Linguistically, their languages differed so much that translators were required for negotiations between the two states. With regard to language, Ukraine shares up to 29 out of 82 linguistic features in common with other Slavic languages, such as Belarus, Czech, Slovak, and Polish, but only 11 in common with Russian. War criminal Putin then says the southern part of Russian lands, including Kiev, began to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, the center that was emerging in Europe. This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was even called the Lithuanian Russian Duchy because Russians were a significant part of this population. They spoke the old Russian language and were Orthodox. I'm going to have to call liar, liar, pants on fire on this. There was never a southern part of Russian lands. There was a southern part of Rus lands. After the sacking of Kiev in 1240, the center of power in southern Rus moved to the kingdom of Galicia Halichina. It still retained control over most of present-day Ukraine until well into the 14th century, for over 100 years after the collapse of Rus. While retaining control over Kiev, its capital moved west to Lviv. The people were called Ruthenians, not Russians. When Lithuania absorbed Ruthenia, it became known as the Duchy of Lithuania and Ruthenia, not the Lithuanian Russian Duchy, as war criminal Putin maintains. And Ruthenians did not speak the Old Russian language because there was no Old Russian language. Though nominally ruled by Lithuania, the Lithuanian Ruthenian Duchy gave a lot of freedom to the Ukrainians, and the duchy was in fact dominated by the Old Ukrainian language. War criminal Putin goes on to say, in 1654, even a bit earlier, the people who were in control over the authority over that part of the Russian lands addressed Warsaw. I repeat, demanding that they send to them rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away. So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these documents. Now, here, war criminal Putin glosses over a significant period, perhaps the most significant and central period of Ukrainian history, and distorts the sequence of events and their significance. War criminal Putin twists himself into a pretzel, trying not to refer to Ukrainians, but awkwardly refers to the people who were in control of the authority over that part of the Russian lands. First, they weren't Russian lands, they were Ruthenian or Ukrainian or Cossack lands. And second, the people who were in control of them were the Ukrainian Cossacks. So, what compelled the Ukrainian Cossacks to sign a treaty with Muscovy? As is everything to do with Ukraine, it's complicated. In the 16th century, Ukraine was absorbed into the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth and came under the harsher rule of Poland rather than the benign treatment when they were part of the Duchy of Lithuania. In 1648, the Cossacks, led by their leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky, led a series of successful uprisings against the Poles and regained authority over most of the Ukrainian lands. While initially successful, he realized that he needed to form alliances. He had four choices, all of which the Cossacks had previously signed alliances with. The Crimean Tatars had proven unreliable, as were the Ottoman Turks. Poland was not willing to give them the guarantees they wanted. So the Cossacks turned to Muscovy, largely on the basis of a common Orthodox religion. So in 1654, the document war criminal Putin is referring to was signed. This was the Treaty of Pereyaslav between Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the leader or hetman of the Ukrainian Cossacks, and Alexander, the Tsar of Muscovy. This treaty marked the first legal relationship of Muscovy and Ukraine since the dissolution of Rus over 400 years before, and marked the sad beginning of Russo Ukrainian relations for the next 337 years until 1991, when Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union. It should be noted that the documents that war criminal Putin wanted to give to Tucker Carlson during the interview are not copies but forgeries of the treaty. The original documents disappeared hundreds of years ago. But they are used by Russians as proof that Russians and Ukrainians are one nation and proof of Ukraine's subservience to so called Russia. Keep in mind that until 1654, Ukrainians and Muscovites had no official relationship for almost 4 centuries. At the time the treaty was signed, they were two separate cultures who didn't even speak the same language, as translators were required during negotiations and for the transcription of the documents. The only reason many Ukrainians speak Russian today is because of the policy of Russification employed by Russia over the centuries, whereby Ukrainian was banned and Russian immigrants were injected into Ukraine. Russians still do not understand the Ukrainian language. So in January of 1654, leaders of the Zaporozhian Cossacks pledged allegiance to the Russian Tsar in exchange for protection from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Not long after signing it, Ukraine and Muscovy both contravened its stipulations and declared war on each other. The leader of the Cossacks, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, hid his copy, and the treaty was never ratified by the Cossack Council of Officers. In 1659, Russian envoys forged another, more restrictive document, which they claimed was the one signed in 1654. 4 years later, the Treaty of Hadjach was signed on 16th of September 1658 in Hadjach between the representatives of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with the Cossack Hetmanate. Its main goal was to create an equal position of Poles, Lithuanians, and Ruthenians through the creation of the Polish-Lithuanian-Ruthenian Commonwealth, a country of three nations, thus abrogating the Treaty of Pereyaslav signed in 1654. But this never came to fruition. However, it illustrates the Ukrainians never intended to be subservient to Muscovy or to recognize Muscovy as the successor of Rus. They were just looking for allies. With reference to the treatment of Ukrainians following this treaty, King Charles XII of Sweden, who had been allied with the Cossacks in many of his battles with Russia, instructed his ambassador in negotiations with the Ottoman Empire in 1711 to do everything in his power to include guarantees of freedom to Ukraine and all Zaporozhians. He wrote, Ukraine has always aspired to be free, but as it is surrounded by Muscovy, the states of Turkey, and Poland, it was compelled to seek a protector and therefore a master in one of these three nations. First of all, it moved under the protection of Poland, which treated it too much as a dependent. Then it gave itself to the Muscovite, who tried to enslave it. Ukrainians enjoyed the privilege of electing a prince known as their hetman, but they were soon deprived of this right, and their hetmans were appointed by the Moscow court. The Treaty of Pereyaslav marked the beginning of Ukrainian and Russian history for the next 337 years. The period from 1654 to the present will be the subject of my next video, so this is probably a good time to end this not so little chat. I'll summarize. The traditional founding date of Kiev is 482 AD. Moscow does not appear anywhere in history until 665 years later. The Kingdom of Rus was founded in Kiev in 882 and lasted for 358 years. It ceased to exist around 1240 with the destruction of Kiev by the Mongols. 43 years after the destruction of Rus, the Grand Duchy of Muscovy was founded in 1283. This marks the beginning of Russian history, first as Muscovy, then as the Russian Empire, then as the USSR, and finally today as the Russian Federation. The center of Rus did not move 900 kilometers to the north to Moscow after the destruction of Kiev by the Mongols. Rus disappeared, but Ukrainians did not disappear, but endured first as the Kingdom of Galicia, within the Duchy of Lithuania and Ruthenia, and then under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1648, Ukraine finally had a chance of forming as a free nation when the Ukrainian Cossacks under Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky defeated the Poles. They needed allies. Consequently, the Cossack Hetmanate, proto-Ukrainian state, made an alliance in 1654 with the Tsardom of Muscovy called the Treaty of Pereyaslav. While the treaty was never officially ratified, it became the basis for so-called Russia's increasing dominance over Ukraine for the next 3.5 centuries. Now, some will say Ukraine was never a nation until 1991. Well, the first modern nation of Ukraine was declared in 1917, when the Russian Empire dissolved as a result of World War I. Then it became one of the founding states of the USSR until 1991, when the USSR dissolved. In addition, 19th century ethnographic maps of Ukraine show that Ukrainians were a majority even outside the present borders of Ukraine, with parts of present-day Russia such as Kursk, Volgograd, Rostov, and southeast Russia having majority Ukrainian populations. Many nations did not achieve nationhood until fairly recent times. Italy and Germany did not become nations until 1861 and 1871, respectively. Canada did not become a nation until 1867. India and Pakistan in 1947. Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993. Serbia in 2006. However, these nations existed as ethnographic entities for centuries prior to formally becoming nations. Israel did not have a country for 1900 years. The Irish were under British dominance for 750 years. To all of you who have managed to continue to listen or at least stay awake during this talk, thank you for listening. Please subscribe to this channel and check the like box. See you next time when we'll continue with the events following the Treaty of Pereyaslav up to the present. Goodbye.